The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, Chapter 18, Death and Resurrection. Ba La Ga'anta. Thanks to the gospel myth makers and cryptographers, we are now able to supply the part the observers of the Bacchic festivals did not, or were not allowed to hear. Another incantory formula, which appears unusually on the surface of the New Testament records, and has thereby caused much speculation among the critics and theologians, is the passage in the Epistle of the Ephesians. Awake, sleeper, arise from the dead, and the Christ will give you light. Calls to sleepers to awaken are common enough in the gospel stories, particularly in those dealing with the agony in the garden before the crucifixion. The interest of this particular incantation is that it is formed from a clever combination and wordplay on names of the sacred mushroom, and even in its final Greek form is openly related to the necromantic cult from which it is derived. Breaking its code leads us to other important names of the holy plant, and to a new understanding of the most famous of all incantations, the Lord's Prayer. The cry, "Awake, sleeper," is a wordplay on the Aramaic level of the Sumerian phrase, on bar, Abba, na im a on, canopy of the sky stretched out above. A descriptive epithet of the mushroom. The last part, na im a on, contains the ancient name of the fertility god hero Adonis, na imman. A shortened form of the whole phrase gave Hebrew its tribal name, Ephraim, and following a different dialectical and vocalic development, the patriarchal name, Abraham, the father of Israel. It is the first element of the name, on bar, found also run together as Abba, father, which has particular interest for us in this study. It means literally, heaven stretch. That is, it offers the picture of a sheltering canopy overhead, and so is used of the father or protector of a family. The Sumerian coming directly into Semitic as Abba, with that meaning, when for the na iman ending in the mushroom name above, the alternative Sumerian ending tabarai is added, and we can at least last solve another perplexing little problem concerned with invocations in the New Testament. In 3 places, the New Testament writers give us a phrase which is a combination of a foreign word, usually assumed to be Aramaic, and an appended translation, Abba, father. Now, it is perfectly true that the Greek ho patir, father, accurately represents the Aramaic Abba, but one would have thought that this extremely common Semitic word for father would have been well enough known even in a Greek-speaking area of the 1st century not to have necessitated a translation every time it appeared in a text. Since also in each case it appears in the Apostles, it is related to the Spirit of God, witnessing in the heart of the believer, and in the 3rd instance it is put into the mouth of Jesus in the garden, praying to God. There might be, in any case, reason for regarding it as some incantory expression of more than ordinary significance. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is the Spirit himself bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. The cry, Abba, ho patir, is simply a play on the Sumerian mushroom phrase, ba tub, bari, the BP and the T being transposed. Daily bread. The invocation of the Father reminds us of the opening words of the Lord's Prayer, repeated millions of times a day all over the Christian world. In the mouth of Jesus, the opening words, our Father who art in heaven, is used frequently as a surrogate for God. The very fullness of the phrase has seemed curious, where one might have expected a simple God, or Father, or the like. The explanation lies in the mushroom title, Ab, Ba, Ta, Ba, PJ, Guy, a rather fuller version of the one cited above and underlying. Abba, father. The cryptographers have tested out the Sumerian into an Aramaic Abi, Debaraki A. Oh my, our Father who art in heaven. Having now penetrated the disguise and laid bare the original Sumerian and the Aramaic phrase made from it, we can now recognize it as a phrase we have all known from our childhood storybooks for a long time. Abra Cadabra. Originally, it had a far more serious intent, and is first found in the writings of one Q. Cyrenius Samacochus of the 2nd-3rd century, a physician of the sect we know as Gnostics. This author left precise instructions for the use of this Kabbalistic phrase, which was believed to invoke beneficent spirits against disease and misfortune. The magic word had to be stitched in the form of a cross and worn as an amulet in the bosom for 9 days, and finally thrown backwards before sunrise into a stream running eastwards. The sect of Gnostics provides one of the major keys to unraveling the mystery of how the mushroom-worshipping Christians became the church of later times. The Gnostics were groups of ascetics, scorning the lusts of the flesh entirely, and convinced that they possessed a secret and mysterious knowledge denied to lesser mortals, vouchsafed to them by revelation from God. They claimed to be connected to their Savior God and the earliest Christians by a secret tradition, and to possess certain mystic writings, which only they could interpret. And the ultimate object of their faith was an individual salvation, the assurance of a blessed destiny for each soul after death. They possessed many such formulae as abracadabra, and having pride of place above all their secret knowledge were the names of the demons. Only when each soul knew such names and could thus control their power, could repeat the holy formulae and display the right symbol, and were anointed, i.e., christened, with a holy oil, and could he find his way to the 7th heaven, the kingdom of light. Thus, a principal feature of Gnosticism was the transmission to one another in strictest secrecy doctrines about the being, nature, names, and symbols of the 7 demons or angels who would otherwise bar their way to achieving the ultimate goal. The movement comes into prominence in the 2nd century AD, and reached its greatest influence in the 3rd quarter of that century, after which it began to wane and was replaced by the closely related and more powerful Manichaean movement. However, many of its ideas survived in mystic circles, at least into the 4th and 5th centuries. What became Orthodox Christianity waged a war with Gnosticism, which it finally won, and the books of the heresy were systematically destroyed. Most of what we know about the sect comes from the writings of its ecclesiastical opponents, but of recent years, some of their lost books of the later period have been found in the sands of Egypt, marvelously preserved, among them the Gospel of Truth. We may hope for more in earlier works, but again, we have to remind ourselves that valuable as these lost works would be, the really secret doctrines are unlikely to have been written down and clear, and the best we can hope for is another cryptic writing like the New Testament. Nevertheless, one fruit of these present researches must be a re-examination of the Gnostic materials that has survived for more decipherable abracadabras. Our Father, who art in heaven, then as a cryptic way of expressing the name of the Savior God, the sacred mushroom. Having broken the code to this extent, it is possible to tackle other outstanding problems in the text. For example, we ask for daily bread upon this day. In point of fact, we have never had a textual justification for doing so, since no one has ever been able to offer a definitive translation for the very rare Greek word epiousian, which the text uses to describe the bread. The rendering daily is probably the least likely possibility. The marginal reading of RSV, our bread for the morrow, is little better. It is only when we recognize the Sumerian name for the sacred fungus, out of which the whole prayer has been spun by wordplay, that we can see just why the cryptographers chose this Greek epithet, and why the other main alternative reading, "give us the bread that is needful," is the correct one. It is an attempt to render the Semitic verb, SPQ, give what is needful, derived from a word play on mashba la anta tab ba ri, read as that which is needful, give now bread. Temptation and preparation for the mysteries. Few parts of the Lord's Prayer have given more trouble to the praying Christian and more scope for the exegety than the verse, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The Greek word for temptation, periosmos, came in for special attention at the time of the decipherment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was realized correctly by scholars that behind this New Testament phrase lay the Semitic word for a place for testing metals, that is, the refiner's crucible. The Essenes in the scrolls talk of the time of testing that is coming, using the technical word. So here, in the prayer, the word jugglers have taken its Aramaic equivalent, kur bukana, crucible of testing, out of ba la gaanta, the mushroom name. The resultant phrase is particularly interesting because it is almost exactly like the Aramaic name of the fungus as it has come down in literature. Kur bakana or kur bakahana, Arabic karbaka, attached, like so many mushroom words, to the plant hellebore. Taking the sacred fungus, or in New Testament parlance, eating the body of the Christ, must have been a very real pierosmos, trial of the body and spirit. It would have seemed no accident to the cultic celebrant that the name of the mushroom and the phrase for fiery furnace of testing appeared the same. The customary translation of this powerful concept as temptation is almost ridiculous, recalling youthful experiences in the jam cupboard or behind the woodshed with the girl next door. Well, might the writer or the Corinthians issue this warning? Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will be guilty of profaning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a man examine himself, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without critically treating his body eats and drinks a crisis upon himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. Isaiah long before had expressed the same warning about the planting of the Adonis, Naaman. Though you make them grow on the day you plant them, and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will lie away in a day of grief and incurable pain. The Amanita muscaria is, after all, a poisonous fungus. Whilst not the most dangerous, its drugs have a serious effect on the nervous system, and taken regularly over a long period would in the end kill the addict. Among its drugs so far isolated are muscarine, atropine, and bufoten. The first causes vomiting and diarrhea and stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system so that the partaker is capable of great feats of muscular exertion and endurance. The stories which came down of the fantastic strength exhibited by cultic heroes, however mythical, and the events described, have probably that element of real fact. So, too, the idea of the Maenads and their wild raving through the conifer forests were capable of tearing animals limb from limb was not entirely devoid of the truth. Atropine first stimulates the nervous system and then paralyzes it. It is this poison that is primarily responsible for the hallucinatory effects of the sacred fungus, but also for the muscular convulsions that they must have, themed to by the bystanders like the demons within, wrestling with the newly imbibed power of the god. Bufotenin, a secretion otherwise found in the sweat glands of the African toad, lowers the pulse rate and temperature. As a result, the mushroom eater has the strange sensation of feeling his skin hot and cold simultaneously, hot in some places and cold in the others. He finds himself hypersensitive to touch, light, and sound. The day following his trip, he will find all smells seem foul, and a bad taste persists in his mouth. He feels an urgent need to urinate, but is unable to do so. We are unfortunately denied reports of such clinical observations as these in ancient literature. The initiates of the mushroom cult explained such sensations in terms of demonology. They believed that the god whose flesh they were chewing, whose blood they were drinking in their drugged wine, was actually within their bodies. It was to be expected that his coming and going would be attended with dreadful physical and mental experiences, and the body needed lengthy preparation for the trial by fire. The actual eating of the bitter, burning fungus top, drinking of the laced wine, and perhaps sniffing up of the powdered agaric-like snuff would be only at the end of days of religious and physical preparation. To obtain some idea of the nature of these preparations and fearfulness with which they were approached, we may read what Pliny says about the hellebore. We have earlier noted that many of the mushroom names have come down to us attached to this potent herb, and it is not improbable that what the first-century botanist tells us about the taking of hellebore similarly reflects traditions which he has picked up concerning the use of the fungus. The best white hellebore is that which most quickly causes sneezing. It is, however, far more terrifying than the black sort, especially if one reads in our old authorities of the elaborate precautions taken by those about to drink it, against shivering, choking, overpowering, and unseasonable sleep, prolonged hiccup or sneezing, fluxes of the stomach, vomiting, too slow or too long, scanty or too excessive. In fact, they usually gave other things to promote vomiting, and drove out the hellebore itself by medicine or enema, or often they used even bleeding. Furthermore, even when the hellebore proves successful as a purge, the various colors of the vomits are terrifying to see, and after the vomits comes the worry of watching the stools, of superintending the bath, of attention to the whole body, all these troubles being preceded by the great terror caused by its reputation, for it is said that meat, if boiled with it, is consumed. It was a fault of the ancient physicians that because of these fears they used to administer this hellebore in smallish doses, since the larger the dose the quicker it is eliminated. Temison gave doses of not more than 2 drachmae. His successors actually increased the amount to 4, because the fine testimonial given to the hellebore by Herophilus, who compared it to truly courageous general, having aroused all within, it itself marches out in the van. Care must be taken, even with favorable treatment, not to administer hellebore on a cloudy day, for to do so is followed by unbearable torture. Indeed, there is no doubt that summer is a better season to give it than winter. For 7 days previously the body must be prepared by acid, or sharp-tasting, foods, and by abstinence from wine. On the 4th and 3rd days before, an emetic must be taken, and on the preceding day there should be abstinence from dinner. White hellebore is given even in a sweet medium. The black variety was considered dangerous if its bitter taste was so disguised with a sweet accompaniment that more was taken than the body could tolerate, although most suitably in lentils or pottage. Recently, the method has been discovered of splitting radishes, inserting hellebore, and then pressing the radishes together again, so that the property of the purge penetrates them. The hellebore is thus administered in a modified form. Vomiting begins after 4 hours, and the whole business is over in 7. Hellebore is never prescribed for old people or children, or for those who are soft and infirm in body or mind, or for the thin or delicate. For women it is less suitable than for men, unsuitable too for the nervous or the hypochondria, are ulcerated or swollen, very bad when there is spitting of blood, pain in the side, or sore throat mixed with pearl barley. It kills rats and mice. The Gauls, when hunting, dip their arrows in hellebore, and they say that the meat, when the flesh around the wound has been cut away, tastes more tender. Flies, too, die if pounded white hellebore and milk are sprinkled about. This last use of hellebore provides any interesting link with Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric, as it is popularly known. Linnaeus gave the fungus the Latin name musca, fly, precisely because of the age-old practice of killing flies or bugs with it. First attested in medieval times, it is said still to be the practice of the continent to break up the mushroom into milk to stupefy flies. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, a sugar solution is made for that purpose, or sugar sprinkled on the cap. Perhaps it is its use to kill vermin, like bugs, that is meant when Pliny reports of black hellebore, that with it they fumigate and cleanse houses, sprinkling it on sheep and adding a formal prayer. So also says Theophrastus, men purify horses and sheep with it, at the same time chanting an incantation, presumably one of the special names of the drug. It is this same authority that states that the white and the black hellebores appear to have nothing in common except the name. One is reminded of the Philistine god Baal-zebub, Lord of the Flies, whom Ahazi sought to consult for a prognosis on his health after he had fallen through his bedroom window. Similarly, the Elian god Muagros was invoked when a swarm of flies brought plague. The flies died as soon as the sacrifice had been made. Similarly, sacrifice to the god Maiodies, flycatcher, at the Olympic Games resulted in the mass immigration of flies from the territory. One has to remember that in those climes and amid the usual lack of sanitation, flies were more than merely a nuisance. And when they ruined the land of Egypt as a result of the pharaoh's intransigence, they were a manifestation of the plague god himself, which is why the Sumerian pest demon Namtar, Greek nectar, or mandrake could kill the pests when all else failed. Thus, to sprinkle hellebore round the house as Dioscorides was thought to preserve it from evil spirits. Pliny thought it strange that hellebore, once regarded with horror, should afterwards become so popular that most scholars took it regularly to sharpen their brains for their studies. It is perhaps to increase in perception faculties that the drug of the Amanita muscaria is said to offer, that we should seek for an explanation for Pliny's curious statement that hellebore should not be given on a cloudy day, for to do so is followed by unbearable torture. Indeed, there is no doubt that summer is a better season to give it than winter. In the story of Lot's visitation by the angels at Sodom, the men of the place disregarded the traditional laws of Eastern hospitality, threatened to break Lot's doors down unless he would release his visitors to their perverted attentions. Despite Lot's generous offer of his virgin daughters in their stead, the men of Sodom persisted in their efforts to reach the new arrivals, who eventually struck them with a mysterious blindness, so that they wearied themselves groping for the door. It is in the same sudden blindness that Yahweh, at Elisha's behest, sends upon the Syrian forces besieging Dothan, and which permitted them to be led away into an ambush. The closest approximation to the unusual Hebrew word for this blindness is found in the Aramaic incantation against a demon who brings about the same condition, described by the Jewish commentators as dazzling sunlight coming through cracks or breaks in the clouds, being worse than the uncovered sun. This sounds like attacks of migraine, characterized by just such flashes of blinding light and pain behind the eyes. But the names point to meanings more connected with a purge or abortifacient than blindness, and may reflect another name for the Amanita muscaria. The increased sensory perceptiveness, which is said to be characterized of the fungus drug, would mean that sudden flashes of light as shafts of sunlight through clouds would be highly uncomfortable, if not acutely painful. Perhaps here we have the basis for those stories of the sudden blindness of Sodom and Dothan, and for the revelatory illumination that strikes Paul on the Damascus road. The mystic under the influence of the mushroom drug might well believe that the common metaphor that associates inspirational knowledge with light in the darkness had become a reality. The kind of myth as that in which a sudden light from heaven flashed about Paul, and when his eyes were opened he could see nothing, would seem a natural expression in story form of this mystic experience. An interesting facet of Pliny's account of the body's preparation for receiving hellebore is the recurrence of the number 7. For 7 days previously, the belly must be given a special diet of sharp-tasting foods, with an emetic on the 4th and 3rd days for abstinence from dinner on the eve of administering the drug. Then vomiting will begin after 4 hours, and the whole business is over in 7. Elsewhere, he says that the life of the mushroom is not more than 7 days. Of course, the number 7 had a very special potency for ancient philosophers, and particularly, as we saw, for the Gnostics. The whole of creation was divided into 7. The Bible allots 7 days for the creation cycle. There were 7 lamps on the candlestick in the temple, representing, so tradition had it, the 7 planets. The Greeks believed that the whole body was renewed every 7 years, and that certain of the 7-year cycles were of special importance. As the age of 14, when a body reaches puberty. At 21, he attains full sexual maturity. At 42, a woman reaches her grand climacteric, the menopause. At 63, men suffer a transitory sexual enfeeblement. The Bible allows mankind but 60 years and 10 on normal reckoning. Nevertheless, the number 7 seems particularly connected with the mushroom and the preparatory stages of treatment required by its use as a drug. In Revelation, the mystic speaks of 7 churches of Asia, which he then proceeds very cryptically to describe. The geographical place name, Asia, is almost certainly a play on the Semitic word for healing, sy, giving Asya, physician, still the most likely Semitic source for the sectarian name, Essenes. And with the 7 churches of healing, we may compare 2 references in the Essenian scroll of the Dead Sea that have recently come to light. In one, the sect is called the 7 divisions of the penitence of Israel. The other, unfortunately broken, quotes 2 biblical passages. The promises of Yalawali are promises that are pure, silver refined in a furnace, purified 7 times. The stone I have set before Joshua, upon a single stone with 7 facets. Its inscription is engraved, says Yahweh. The broken commentary following these quotations begins, and I shall heal. It appears, therefore, that here, as in the New Testament reference, there is a conception of a 7-fold purification, or healing. The figure of the Refming furnace in the Psalms quotation is just that of the temptation motif in the scrolls and the New Testament, based, as we have seen, verbally and clinically, on the sacred mushroom. And the preparation of body and mind, necessary before the participant in the mysteries reaches the climax of the fungus-eating ritual. There must then have been 7 stages of inward purification. The 7 degrees of initiation of the widespread religion Mithras, the Persian sun god, may serve as an illustration even if the connection goes no deeper. Since Mithraism was also a mystery religion, we know all too little about its doctrines and secrets. But the 7 stages of initiation have been left marked in the pattern of the mosaic floors of their meeting places, and there would appear from the design to have been a major break between the first 3 and the last 4 stages. One is reminded of Pliny's account of preparation for hellebore. An emetic has to be taken on the 4th and 3rd days before, as if it were thought that the body at that stage had reached some particular point of crisis. In Mithraism, the 7 stages are linked with the 7 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, with the sun and moon. In the New Testament, too, the 7 churches are consciously identified with the 7 stars. And as for the mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, says the visionary mushroom holder of the keys of death and the underworld, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Substitution and atonement. Christian theology has Jesus as the great atoning sacrifice made by God for mankind. The Son of God, the image or replica of the Divine Father, is sent to earth and sacrificed as an atonement to heal the rift that is open between God and the world. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled himself to us and gave us the service of reconciliation, exchange. We saw in an earlier chapter how the state of imbalance or sin brought about when crops were plundered from Mother Earth, and more especially when the holy plant was snatched from her womb, had to be reconciled with the compensatory offerings. Only the God himself could satisfactorily atone for this sacrilege. We noted that the sacred prostitute had to bring to the task of fascinating the phallic mushroom, a replica of the thing itself, hanging from her hand, as Josephus says. A liturgist around 1400 E in ancient Syria cried to Baal to send down compensatory offerings for the release of the mandrake. He calls it, in the Ugaritic consonantal script, RBDD, which thanks to Sumerian, we can now decipher as furrow appeaser, and recognize it in the Greek name of the holy plant, Orobadion. The ancient hymn then is asking the fertility god to send down the mandrake's equivalent to compensate the ground for its deprivation. In the name of the first day of the Anthistaria ceremony, Pythogia, we may now recognize the same religious activity. Compensatory offering as an atonement for a holy plant, the Sumerian, from which we may now trace the derivation of the Greek word, has the phrase gaidu, table of offerings, and igi, face, that is, offerings of the presence, the precise equivalent of the Hebrew bread of the presence or face, the so-called shewbread, which was placed before Yahweh in the temple. These loaves are simply a further instance of the atoning gifts spoken by the ancient botanists as cakes or loaves or honeycombs to fill the hole vacated in the ground by the holy plant, and more precisely described by Josephus as the mandrake's equivalent necessary for a safe removal of the plant by the Dead Sea. All refer to the mushroom itself by allusion to the characteristic bun shape of all important cap containing the drug. When dried and skewed for preservation, these fungus lozenges were represented by the dehydrated masoth loaves of the unleavened bread of the Israelites' Passover food, probably related linguistically, if not materially, with the Mazonians of the Dionysic cake feasts. The New Testament relates the expiatory crucifixion of Jesus with the sacrifice of the Passover lamb of Exodus. For Christ, our paschal lamb has been sacrificed. The story in the Old Testament, which is advanced to explain the origin of this offering of the spring lamb, rests in part upon a pun. The name of the animal, Pesach, is fancifully related to the verb Pesach, Passover, and made to refer to a myth in which the plague demon was induced to avoid the houses of the Israelites when he smote the firstborn of Egypt, man and beast. In order to procure this mercy, the people had to sacrifice a lamb for each family and sprinkle its blood on the doorposts and lintels of the houses where it was eaten. The name of the festival derives, in fact, from another Semitic root, appease, quieten. It signifies that peace which comes after the agony of parturition, when pain is forgotten and the newly born child or animal rests at its mother's side. Cultically, the Pesachal festival, Passover, combined gratitude to the fertility deity for the new birth and a ritualistic attempt to atone for the rape of the womb by a sacrifice of the first fruits. In the Bacchic Anthistaria and in the Christian Easter, this Passover principle was enshrined in cults and mythology. The Christians saw their Christ, the anointed, and the stretched drawn forth, the double play on the root im-sha-ka, as the divinely sent substitute offering for the rape of the fungus harvest. He is raised up as the little cross, sacrificed, returns to the earth whence he came, and then resurrected to new life. He is a microcosm of the natural order. He sets the pattern and provides the means whereby celebrants of the mysteries may be crucified with the Christ and enter into a mystic experience of a purged and reborn soul, brought afresh from the creative womb of the earth. Truly, truly, I say to you, says Jesus to Nicodemus, unless one is born anew, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said to him, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? And Jesus answered, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. And into the story of the betrayal and crucifixion of Jesus, the New Testament cryptographers wove another of their special compository names for the sacred fungus. It lies in the incident after the crucifixion when Judas, overcame by remorse for his betrayal, buys or has bought on his behalf a piece of land which is called the Field of Blood, supposed to represent an Aramaic popular place name, Akeldama. The story runs as follows. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that he was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in betraying innocent blood. They said, What is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed. And he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money. So they took counsel, and brought with them the potter's field, to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the Field of Blood to this day. A slightly different version of the story adds more enlivening details and describes the purchase of the field to Judas himself. Now this man bought a field with the reward of his wickedness, and bending over he burst open in the middle, and all his inwards fell out. And it became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that field was called in their tongue Akeldama, that is, Field of Blood. Details of the story, like the 30 shekels and the buying of a field by right of redemption, are of course borrowed by the storyteller from passages in the Old Testament. Further, graphic features like poor Sicariot's losing the contents of his belly owe much to the somewhat earthy, not to say lavatorial humor of the writer, since the sacred fungus whose name the arch-betrayer bore was a powerful purge. Far more significant, indeed, the point of the whole unlikely tale. Why should the temple police need guiding to a spot a few hundred yards away from the city walls and have pointed out to them the person they had been watching for days? Is the title of the field Akdelma? We are here given another of the cryptographer's pseudo-translations, reading the word as if it were the Aramaic Kakaldama, Field of Blood, whereas what it really represented was the Aramaic akaldame, food of price or compensation. One can follow the storyteller's line of thought in weaving his tale around the price idea, featuring it as the blood money received by the betrayer Judas, and relating it to the strange passage in Zechariah about the wages paid to the shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. But we can also see now for the first time how such a name as food of compensation fits precisely into the pattern of such epithets for the holy plant as Orbadonian, for furrow appeaser, and the bread of the presence of the Jewish temple, and the Bacchic Anthostaria, raising the dead. In raising the sacred fungus, the participants of the Anastaria festival were calling up the dead. It is expressly stated by the ancient writers that the Anastaria was devoted to tending the souls of the departed, and that during the festival the dead were supposed to rise to the upper world. The cult of the sacred mushroom, then, was a manifestation of necromancy, divination by the dead. This extraordinary practice, attested all over the ancient world, lives on in various kinds of spiritualism. The root of the idea is that, since the souls left their bodies and returned to the bowels of the earth, they are in closer touch with the waters of knowledge, as the subterranean abyss was called. It follows that if one can draw them back in some way, they can impart information about future that is hidden from being still imprisoned by their faisal. In the Old Testament, we have the story of Saul in desperation for some guidance on future events. Yahweh, having deserted his normal oracular devices, consulting a witch who lived at Endor. At first, suspicious of his intentions, since Saul, in a burst of pious enthusiasm, had earlier banished spiritualist mediums of her kind, the witch eventually was prevailed upon to disturb Samuel at his kind. At his rest, "What do you see?" asks Saul. "I see God, Elohim, coming out of the ground," she replies. "What does he look like?" questions her client. "Like an erection." So the ancient versions. Wearing a robe, whereupon Saul recognized the dead Samuel's ghost, although for all the comfort that was forthcoming from that somewhat petulant source, he might have saved himself the trouble of his visit. This connection between the sacred fungus and the omniscient souls of the dead leads to its names being often connected with demons of death. Thus, the Sumerian Namtar, which came into Greek as nectar, our nectar, is used generally for plague demon, and the Old Testament Lith, the so-called night hag, which Isaiah threatens will haunt a desolate Edom, is probably an original mushroom word. In the New Testament, rare reference is made to a festival called the Agape, so-called love feast. The Syriac translators, at any rate, thought the practice had to do with the comforting of the dead, and this certainly accords well with the meaning of agapo, love. This Greek word, so favored by the New Testament writers, is used by the tragedians for affections of the dead, and specifically in the Bible for the relationship between man and God. It is popularly used in the Greek version of the Old Testament to translate a Hebrew word for seduce, allure. Its Sumerian original, ag, means love, and also stretch, measure. Semantically, the equal of the Semitic draw out. A cognate verb in Greek is ago, lead, bring up, draw out, etc. Used in such words as nekragogos, leading forth the dead. Pushkagogio, conjure up souls from the netherworld, and so on. The agape seems to have involved a common meal of some kind. Although New Testament references are too cryptic to tell us much, and post-biblical accounts of the agape, as of most other aspects of real nature of Christianity and its rites, too unreliable. As if one suspect, the agape is in fact another name for the fungus itself, and when the feast will have included the eating of the mushroom's flesh and drinking of its juice, in other words, it will have been identical with the Lord's Supper, the eating of the raised or crucified Christ. I have been crucified with Christ. I live, yet it is no longer I, but Christ lives in me. Thereafter the celebrant possesses the mystic knowledge of God, so earnestly desired by the followers of the mysteries. I bow my knees before the Father, that he may grant you to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you may have power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Isaiah also looked for the manifestation of the spirits of the dead. He identified them with the giants of old, the Rephaim, whose gift of knowledge to mankind had proved a not unmixed blessing. Thy dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For thy dew is a dew of light, and on the land of the shades thou wilt let it fall. We noticed this passage previously when discussing the mushroom as the morning star, germinated by the dew that fell from the Venus before the dawn. It was pointed out that the Rephaim were those cast down from heaven, identified with the fallen angels of Genesis in Jewish mythology. According to the Bible, these sons of God were seduced by the beauty of mortal women and begot a race of supermen. Later, Jewish tradition has it that their seduction was at least partly their own fault, since they had taught the girls the art of cosmetics, and had so begun the awful progress of mankind to degeneracy and sexual abandon. More important, they taught them the charms and enchantments, the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. To raise these dormant spirits of the dead was the way to enlightenment. However, the noises produced by those through whom the Spirit spoke were not necessarily intelligible. Isaiah speaks of such necromancers or ventriloquists, belly speakers, scornfully as chirping and muttering, when they seek by oracle their God through the dead on behalf of the living. And in the New Testament it is called speaking with tongues. Thus, the faithful are encouraged to pursue love, agape, be zealous for spiritual gifts, especially that you might prophesy. For one speaking in a tongue speaks not to man but to God, for no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. He who prophesies is greater than he who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be edified. If even lifeless instruments, such as the flute or harp, do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? So with yourselves, if you in a tongue utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? For you will be speaking into the air. Therefore, he who speaks in a tongue should pray for the power to interpret. Tongues are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers, while prophecy is not for unbelievers, but for believers. If therefore the whole church assembles and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, they will not say, "You are mad," which was perhaps better than accusing them, like the apostles at Pentecost, of being filled with new wine. And looking back over the discussion of this chapter, we can see how the worship of the mushroom encompassed every aspect of the processes of nature. When modern religious practice seems at times removed from reality, a Saturday or Sunday relaxation, even entertainment, rather than a concerted effort to influence the deity or be influenced by him. It is worth reminding ourselves that for the ancients it was a life or death matter. If the god did not respond to their pleas for rain or sunshine, they, their children, and their crops and animals died. When, before their eyes, the greenness of the ground vanished under the wilting heat of the summer sun, the dwellers of the Near Eastern lands then, as now, viewed the future apprehensively. Everything depended on God's bounty in the autumn and following spring. The enemy, in their mythological terms, had killed the fertility hero. Would the new year see his resurrection? In the little mushroom, men could see a prime example of the transience of nature's gifts. In the morning it appeared, and by nightfall the worms had consumed it. The god himself had been among them. They sought him and apprehended him, but his manifestation was a temporary thing. For one fleeting moment he fulfilled his promise that those who received him could become the children of God. The worshippers could not approach the god empty-handed. He must bring with him a gift, itself God-given, as an atonement to the earth. Only thus, and by calling simultaneously upon the god by name, could he withstand the demonic power of the fungus. For to eat the god was to die with him, and in the short hours of the initiate's complete communion with the deity he had died to the world. It was then that he was at most fearful risk, and the days of careful preparation for the ultimate mystery were given their most crucial testing. This was the time of trial, or temptation, through which every participant in the cult passed. To raise the sacred fungus was to raise the spirits of the dead, and thus to communicate with the source of subterranean knowledge. This we may now identify with the Bacchic Anthistaria and possibly the church's agape feast, the drawing up of the phallic mushroom. Very much earlier than the documentary recording of either of these cultic practices is the raising of the fungus in the so-called gardens of Adonis. For long, this mystic practice has remained obscure in its details, although there has been little doubt that it had to do with the lamenting and raising of the dead god, and thus presumed to be connected with an agricultural cult. And for the first time, we can decipher the names involved, and are thus able to draw together a number of other references to the mushroom religion and those who partook in its rites. End of chapter. Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.